out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are really happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to interest startups in being part of BetaWorks' upcoming Accelerator Think Camp. BetaWorks is a New York City-based incubator and accelerator. They've run 7 camps before on topics from bots to synthetic media and voice interfaces. You can find more about Think Camp and this domain by going to betaworks.com/camp, all lowercase. I'm Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper. And our topic today is From Second Brains to Collective Brains. I have 2 guests, Sari Azout and Rufus Griscom. Sari is most recently the founder of Startupy, which offers startup advice and resources. And Rufus has started many things, the most relevant ones here being Helio and the Next Big Idea Club. And their taglines are actually really great. Helio's tagline is elevating ideas. And the Next Big Idea Club is learn better, live smarter. And that seems like really topical to our call here because we're trying to figure out, I'm assuming you were part of the conversation about elevate ideas, and that just seems like a really nice, crisp expression. What does that mean for you?
I got my start as a book editor in New York, 25 some years ago, and a book is an idea delivery vehicle. I love books, and they're fantastic, but they're where a lot of ideas go to die. I
love that you said that before I got to. I love that.
I mean, it's sort of, books are beautiful. People love to brandish them and talk about them much more than people like to read them. And you see this in the data. The average person finishes about 18 to 20% of a nonfiction book. And so we want to help deliver ideas in more powerful ways and connect people with thinkers and thinkers with thinkers, readers with readers, and so on. So that's our broader mission.
I love that. Sari, your sort of path into this is startup culture, startups helping startups thrive. How does that fit for you with what we know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think much like you, Jerry, I've been a mind mapper for a while. My career has been in tech and startups. I was doing a lot of consulting for startups, investing in startups. And so I started a personal Airtable database. My version of Jerry's brain was on Airtable. And it's sort of like over the years became this like gigantic interconnected database. Initially, a lot of it was startup knowledge, because every time I had a new client, I had to like connect the dots across fields. And it sort of dawned on me one day that this would be a lot more powerful in a collaborative setting. And that sort of took me down this rabbit hole where I've been sort of like cooking this idea over the years. And I finally like summoned the courage a couple of months ago to basically, I just can't stop thinking of anything else. I need to figure out how you make something like this multiplayer. And so at Startupy, we say that we're building software to help humans curate the best knowledge on the internet in multiplayer mode. One of the best sort of like analogies, I think, for people who have been in the internet for a long time and also today is think of it as Delicious meets Rome. So a place where you can build your digital library in a networked way where your links bump into other people's. And we can get into all the challenges around building something like that. But it keeps me up at night. It keeps me excited. And I just can't think of anything else that would make me happier to work on right now.
So I'm also excited about how we're all in on this. All 3 of us, I think, just have a lot of energy focused on this. I love also that you mentioned Delicious. Do you mind riffing for a moment about what was cool about Delicious? Because I had a friend back then, a digital historian, who was telling me about how 19C was a hashtag on Delicious, where the historian community who cared about the 19th century was busy like sharing tags they found. And there was some kind of collective intelligence brewing there, right? And then Delicious got bought by Yahoo and then got killed off. It's sort of the black thumb of Yahoo kind of took care of Delicious. And I'm a little surprised that Pinboard hasn't really, like it's dead. It's like there's no real Delicious right now out there. But what's your own experience with it, and why is that an inspiration for this?
I was too young when Delicious was around, but so I sort of have only spent a lot of time reading about it. I've like, fallen down the rabbit hole in like old forums to try to understand it. I think in some ways, the information environment has changed drastically since then. And so if you think about a lot of what I've read about it seems to point to the direction of Google ended up actually being a lot better for search than this. But if you fast forward to today, when we don't have like top-down media, it's not like a publisher-driven model. You have like, the supply of content continues to fragment and nicheify. I just think that the problem of just navigating information in more associative ways is just a lot more important, it feels like, today. And so I sort of feel like it's the right moment to revive something like this, just because of a function of how drastically the information environment's changed.
Absolutely. Rufus, did you have any experience on Delicious? Were you on there?
I really was not, no. But I'm very curious. I've done less exploring with the software around tools for thinking, but I'm desperate for it and I'm very excited about it. So I'm cheerleading.
I love that. I used to be a tech industry trends analyst. So one of my little taglines was, I waste my time so you won't have to, which is why I just used to try thing after thing after thing. I have logins on I don't know how many platforms that have long since died, and they're somewhere in the bit bucket out there. But also, Sari, you pointed to something that sticks in my head a lot, which is we seem to have outsourced our memories to Google. And that seems to me to have been a mistake. Not that I don't like Google, and I don't think that Google search is pretty darned excellent, but it's a real mistake to think, oh, I'm not going to bother curating that thing I saw that's really useful and interesting and important, and I'm kind of probably want to remember later on. I think it's a mistake to just say, oh, I'll just Google for it later, which feels like the default setting for a lot of us because we don't have the tools yet for sharing what we know really well.
Yeah, I think, I've spent a lot of time on thinking about search, and I think that Google works really well when you want an answer to a very objective question. But when you want the most interesting perspectives on a subject, Google's not going to show you, like the best perspectives are probably written by thinkers who are not optimizing for SEO, right? The people optimizing for SEO are the content marketers and not the operators who are just like writing things that are just not going to be optimized for SEO. So I think that search deteriorating in quality is a big reason why we need to transition from making these tools single player to making them multiplayer, because discovery is becoming a much bigger problem. In a world of information overload, knowing what to pay attention to is the hard part. And we have these amazing brains, like yours happens to be public, but it's still hard to find if we don't know who Jerry is. And I'm sure there's just a gold mine of wisdom there. So a really hard problem to solve, but it seems like to become more and more pressing.
Absolutely. How do you both describe the benefits of multiplayer to anyone else, maybe including yourselves? Like we're sitting here, we have as a shorthand to communicate the frame for this call. It's like single player tools versus multiplayer. Why?
I would go back to the history of singular authorship versus multiple authors, right? So if we think about, I think of like television, to my knowledge, was the first genre where the idea that you'd have a writer's room or a collection of writers, and that collection of writers would produce a meaningfully better television show than an individual writer, just became the kind of dominant thinking, right? And movies were still written by single individuals, but television shows were written by multiple people. Now more and more movies are being written by groups of people. And because we ingest at the Next Big Idea Club, 1,000 books a year, we're in a position to observe that the number of books with co-authors or multiple authors is increasing. And then even when you have a book, right, written by a single author, in fact, it has many authors. And the question is it acknowledged or is it not acknowledged, right? And from a storytelling perspective, if you think of, for instance, like *Sapiens* by Harari, wonderful book, it just warms my heart as a lover of kind of big ideas and trying to better understand ourselves as a species, that the book Sapiens sold over 10 million copies. So that's just a wonderful thing. But one of the things that Harari did, and I say this with great deep respect for him, is he didn't footnote. Really, the ideas in that book were 95% ideas that were developed by 100 different people, massive research. But he did something that was beautiful from a storytelling perspective, which is he didn't stop to cite all the other people every step of the way. He just told the story of the history of humanity as it's best understood today. So I think we have a problem around authorship and storytelling, and we still have a mythology around the singular writer, the singular storyteller. We all want to be original, right? But the reality is that all of our best thinking as a species is done collectively. Like we do think together. The question is, how effectively do we think together, and to what degree do we admit it? Because I could, one final comment from ingesting 1,000 books a year is that we also know that, like, all these brilliant books which we love, and I interview a different author every week. When you read a very large quantity of books, you realize how much overlap there is. There's a massive of course there is, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, as it should be, right? There are all these great scientific studies that are cited in 30 different books in the last, several years. And that's not transparent to the readership base. And probably many of these authors would prefer that it were, if there were an easy way to sort of expose the links, as it were, right? And build on each other's ideas in a way that was transparent.
I see that a lot because when I use the mind map, when I read books, I'll see that things trail back. There's kind of this culture of citing a lot of psychology and sociology in the post-Gladwell era, let's call it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of books that are coming out right now sort of trace their way back to a lot of the same kinds of studies. And so Jonathan Haidt and Carol Dweck and whoever else are kind of ringing the same sorts of bells. And we don't have much of a place to notice that. And then to have the conversation about the overlaps and the differences of perspective on the same topic, for example, and then to deepen that and maybe set up some questions to experiment or explore, right? We kind of don't have a place for that. We're lucky if some podcast interviewer or some reviewer in an article somewhere asks a couple of good questions, and then they're just kind of stuck there in whatever that place is. It's a podcast transcript or it's a blog post, right? But there's sort of if you ask me where Wikipedia is, I can point to it and I can tell you there's this virtual encyclopedia in many languages and it lives here and this is its funding model.
Yeah.
This other thing about shared knowledge and shared insights and collective wisdom doesn't have a place yet or a name yet. And I'm really interested in that quest.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's a really nice angle here about the social creation of knowledge that you're tapping into.
This was also I had the pleasure of talking with Walter Isaacson about his latest book about the evolution of our gene editing and so on, and he made the comment that Nobel Prizes in science are going to groups more frequently, but always inadequately acknowledging the number of scientists involved in all those discoveries, right? So really, where do you stop? We might go from acknowledging one scientist to 3, but really the right number might be 25. And that's a problem for us emotionally because I've come to believe that humans really like the story of individual genius. And like the individual through, sheer inspiration, changing the world by him or herself. And there's something kind of heroic about that. In my mind, there's something even more beautiful about the idea that dozens and dozens and dozens and hundreds of people all collaborating in open ways, are in fact the source of those revolutions.
Mm-hmm. I think the slightly sexist name for this is the great man theory of history.
Yeah.
It's like there's, Napoleon, and Napoleon did all this stuff and so forth. And then there's also some piece of ego involved, and there's some piece of attribution, just having sort of clarity or simplicity maybe involved. Sadi, what do you say?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, very informed by Marshall McLuhan's, like, the tools shape us. And I think that when I think of multiplayer, my mind goes to networks like Twitter and Reddit and Instagram, and they are all tools that are designed for entertainment, not for sense making. And they are tools where on Twitter, it's all about my hot take, and I am the protagonist. I am building my personal brand. It's not a space for, calm, collective thinking. And so I think that in many ways, what we're seeing in the tools for thought space, it's a lot of it is personal productivity. And if you think about the multiplayer network tools that exist today, they're largely about audience building. And so what happens when you combine personal productivity with social discovery? And I think that's what we haven't seen enough of. I think what we do know is we finally have seen the experiments of these social networks. What happens when you design a system where everything is put to a popularity test, or you have to condense everything to 280 characters. On Instagram, I'm less likely to be honest because it's not going to get too many likes. And, how honest can I be in a visual about, what my life looks like? And so I think so much of this is an interface challenge of how do you design for the psychology of people feeling the freedom to express versus the pressure to perform. And so I'm very interested in just what does the interface for this look like? Because we know what happens when our interfaces are all about, performing and building a brand and an audience. But if you think about, what you've built with Jerry's Brain, what I built on Airtable, I'm very happy to share that. And I think most people would be happy to share that. But if everything that I shared was put to a popularity test, it would just radically alter the things that I would put in my brain. So I think it's largely an interface and design challenge around how do we take these multiplayer networks that we've built, but orient them around perhaps not chronological feeds that are obsessed with the present, perhaps in ways that allow us to make sure that the content appreciates over time. Because on Twitter, the content depreciates. But what if you augment that with more context, more relations, more associations? And so, I guess I've been trying to move from theory to practice, spending a lot of time on Figma and trying to really figure out what this stuff looks like, because I don't think we have too much of a precedent for what this can look like.
Totally agree. One thing about Twitter, which is I may be having a different Twitter experience than you are. And one thing I tell people is if you treat Twitter the way you do Facebook or LinkedIn, you're really screwing it up. Do not follow all your friends and everything else. You must tune your Twitter feed so that you're actually following people who work for you, whatever that might mean. And for me, the showboating means I unfollow people. So therefore, my Twitter feed is full of a bunch of people who are on the other side of the equation you just sort of showed us of how attention, gets people who are busy trying to grab attention. And I really like my Twitter feed at this point. Also, I'm Twitter user number 509. I'm the 900th person on the planet who signed up for this thing way back when. And I don't have a zillion followers. And I'm not the best, Twitter user. But it actually is the first place I turn to for what happened today. Twitter at this point is beating any news service or news organization or whatever else for me in that particular way. And then second, completely different thought, but Twitter is yet another stream that I have to check all the time. I call this my sweep. Like what is your sweep? In what order do you check your socials? How often every day? And what do you do about it? This is like a big time eater for a whole bunch of us. It's like, woof. And part of the problem is when these things drift by, it's a little bit like we're watching Tetris pieces go by, except they don't settle in and go away. They just vanish, right? And so my problem with most streaming services is that there's no place to put the things that were really worthwhile, the really shiny nuggets that went floating by, the things that were great. And I feel really fortunate that I have a place to put them, this sort of persistent memory. And so persistence is this really rare, weird word in today's social media world landscape, because everything is flow and almost nothing is stock, right?
It reminds me of Mike Caulfield's like The Garden and the Stream, and how Facebook and Reddit, Twitter, they're just poor models for learning and research, because it's, Twitter's use case was designed for obsolescence. It was what is happening today. Tomorrow that doesn't matter anymore. But it's not really designed to be something timeless, something that, how often do you go back to look at, an old tweet? It's just the interface is not conducive to that kind of.
Exactly. I just tweeted today about, when did Twitter become a long form publishing medium? Because my feed is full of threads. Like everybody's writing a 30 tweet thread. And I'm like, no. Go post an essay somewhere and give us a couple call outs, but don't eat my feed. Sorry. Rufus, what do you wish you could do with like nobody reads 1,000 books a year, except you collectively can filter 1,000 books a year, and everybody's stack of things, oh my God, I've got to read these things, keeps growing and we don't make our way through. How can we actually collaboratively digest these things to the point where our reading is more focused on just the piece that really matters? What do you envision? What do you wish we had that would let us get through that better? Or maybe what are you building that'll get us there?
Our view is that one should be able to, that in practice, every thinker, every writer earns the reader's attention one sentence at a time. And so, if I put forth a sentence that is adequately interesting, you might listen to the next one, or you might turn off this chat.
Nolan Bushnell, the inventor of Pong, is very famous for saying, "You have 1 minute to earn the next quarter."
Right, there you are.
Yeah, there's no instruction set. It's like, here's the joystick, here's the quarter, go.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So we kind of think that writers that ideas should be presented with, as they are. First, you have a title. Then you have, these days, you almost always have a subtitle of a book, and then you have sort of the one sentence elevator pitch. Then you have the paragraph. Then you have the blog post. Then you have the TED Talk. Then you have it's almost an expanding accordion of the engagement earned. But there's a very sudden jump today to, from the paragraph or the book review to a 10 to 15 hour reading experience. And so we're empowering authors to deliver those first short versions in both audio and text in ways that are very accessible. And then a 10 to 15 minute, the 5 key insights from the book in both audio and text. But the other thing that we're doing in parallel is beginning to map the world of ideas. Is to say, and to invite authors to say, what are the 6 books that most influence your book, and and then to have our team do that as well, so that it becomes very easy for a reader or a learner to, and we like to say learner because there are 10 learners for every reader, really, right? To discover adjacent ideas that are powerful and that help them live better lives and learn more about the world.
What does this map feel like, look like, sound like, work like to your best ability at this point? I totally agree. Mapping the world of ideas sounds completely awesome. Where, is it like on a piece of vellum with some ink? No. How do we get there?
We're not yet at a stage to answer that question, but I think that I think it has to be. I think we both need an app that learns about your interests and can make suggestions, but also just offer different kind of adjacencies. More practical, more expansive, more inspirational, more and have more linking opportunities effectively, inside of the text.
Yeah.
Something I think a lot about is how do we transition from information that demands our attention to information on demand, right? So you have this universe of ideas, but I'm a human, my memory storage is limited. But when I'm thinking about a problem, when I'm, this is when I need the relevant context and ideas. And so as you're mapping, Rufus, these ideas, how do you think about when do people encounter these? Is it search? Is it 100% discovery based? Because so much of what I think is wrong is you open Twitter for entertainment. And in my experience writing a Substack newsletter, the magic is when you put all of these ideas, whether it's in a spatial canvas or something else, you have them all in front of you and you're trying to develop a thesis or there's some sort of like output or goal. And so I'm curious, like, how much do you think about, are these ideas meant to inspire? Is this something that could lead to like more goal-oriented outputs?
Yeah, I think ideally, if we do it right, we'll be able to offer the learner what he or she is looking for. I mean, there are a lot of people who really are looking for life hacks and optimization, and just to be better at living and working and thinking and breathing and everything else. And then there's the inspiration, mind expansion. I'd like to learn that I'm wrong. I'm open to changing my mind. I wouldn't mind at the end of this process believing something different from what I believe now. That's a much smaller subset, I think, of learners who actually have that appetite. But I think we'd love to empower everyone to find what they're looking for, and very, very much we want to provide the tools for authors themselves to reference and point people to all the adjacent ideas, and also the sources that inspired their thinking.
I love this idea of openness to changing your mind, and I agree with you, unfortunately, that this is a small sliver of humanity that's really actually honestly open to changing their mind a bunch. Although probably more people will present that way than will actually act that way. Have you thought much about, like, how do you get people to the place where they'll consider the possibility of maybe softening something they believe in strongly?
My view is that culture is really more plastic more mutable, more changeable, evolves more quickly than we realize. And you can see this over the course of decades. As people love to say, there's less change over a year, more change over 10 years than people think. So I do think that we can get to a place of people being less kind of greedy about singular authorship, which is, I think, a cultural change that we need, along with, I totally agree with what Sari was saying about, part of it is the tools. We are made by the tools that we have. We are a product of the tools, and we need to provide people with tools. And I think that will be part of the change. And I think as people see how gratifying it is to engage in multiplayer thinking, connected thinking, extended mind thinking, that I like to think that this will be part of a cultural shift towards more of this kind of openness. And I think with that, hopefully, also comes this willingness to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you think about it, of course, this is not an original idea. There are very few to be had. But how can you be confident that you're actually learning if you don't change your mind? I'm 54 years old. I've only realized this in the last few years, that there's nothing to be proud of. I think if you'd asked me five years ago, I probably would have said, well, yeah, I feel like I figured most things out to some degree. And now I'm just incredibly eager for these moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I just changed my mind a little bit. Isn't that so beautiful?
I love that.
And I still think it's largely like we shape our tools and then they shape us. Like the stream, back to what you were saying, Jerry, it encourages a hot take that is completely divorced of context. Whereas a digital garden is not trying to say like, this is the answer. It's trying to build a model of the world that can generate new understandings, that acknowledges nuance and complexity. And so if we could expose some of that nuance, some of that complexity, it's just very different from having to condense to 280 characters. This is how the world works, because the world is shades of gray.
I even miss 140 characters, I'm afraid to say, because now we take 280 sort of for granted. One of the things in my amateur theory of how these things work, one of the things that I think causes people to soften up and consider change is conversation, like other humans, and not necessarily tripping across an essay or even like really well-produced videos like Annie Leonard's The Story of Stuff, which cost like 130,000 to produce, I think affected a lot of people about, oh my God, we have too much stuff, it's destroying us. And that's one way of changing people's minds. But I think, and I'm wondering how this gets architected into software and services that either of you might be building, but how do you get people over to useful, interesting, appropriate conversations that they might have? And the obvious first, I think, issue that pops up is, oh my God, scale. You can't have 1,000 people in a conversation. Gotcha. How do you get maybe fractally distributed little ripple conversations all over the place that work? Or is that important? And for me, so much of changing your mind is social, and that one of the strongest weapons or techniques in mind changing is somebody kind of like you, who you trust, taking you by the hand to try a new and different thing that you weren't going to try on your own.
Well, I would say one very small way would be that I think the phenomenon that is podcasting, I think has been, I mean, of course, there are lots of reasons to be pessimistic about, cultural trends, but I think the podcast has had a profoundly positive impact on, global culture, and it's been a force of longer format conversation and less polarization, more of a willingness to to listen to other people, and the pace of it. What's interesting to me is you look on YouTube and you look at video in general as a genre, and there's always more and more text scrolling around the bottom and things flashing up, and because it's Las Vegas, because video has incredibly short retention. You're constantly terrified of losing the viewer. And somehow we have developed this cultural space for people to listen for an hour to a few people talking, and that's just I think a beautiful thing. But I think how to develop new kind of tools for conversation as part of tools for thinking, I think that's a super interesting question.
Thanks, Sari.
Yeah, I mean, we've stayed away from comments just because it introduces a whole new content moderation challenge. And in general, I think that when you write a blog post, you record a podcast, typically more thought goes into it, right? It's less of a spur of the moment reaction. There's less impulsivity. And so, we're starting with curating and interconnecting the world's best tweets and content and, having all sorts of connections. I think there's a lot to be said about how you can improve conversation, but it's a very complex problem with all sorts of moderation.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're reminding me that the VTaiwan platform that they use for civic engagement in Taiwan, which is really a world-leading way to actually make decisions as a body of citizens, they discovered early on, and this goes back to sometimes the design issues are really subtle, that they could really clamp down on flame wars by getting rid of the reply feature. So in order to make a comment, you had to start a new thread. You had to start a comment. You couldn't just reply and say, no, this is bogus, this is terrible. You had to go to a new place and attract people to your conversation as well. And tiny things, and I'm not sure I love it, but what you can do, what anyone can do to design in a way to get people back into considering each other's opinions, I find to be beneficial in some way. And the media are not designed mostly to do that. Mostly it's like, how do we heat this up? How do we heat the space up so that there will be controversy, so that we attract more users spending more minutes of their lives in this space?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a podcast that I heard, this was a while ago, Jack Dorsey talking about Twitter's mistakes and how he wishes they would have hired a game theorist early on to think about the potential repercussions of what a retweet button and a retweet with comment button would do, and what happens when you have a like count next to a like button, and all of these like small design considerations have such a massive impact as these platforms scale that I think it's better to be slow and very thoughtful and very deliberate about how you introduce conversation, just because of how complex humans are.
Yeah, we are. How do we convince people to contribute what they're thinking or saying to the commons? How do we convince them to go from single player, like, oh, I found a cool tool, I took a course, I now have a little workflow, and I'm building my web of connections and blocks and data and links and interactions and sharing it out. And then there's the immediate subsidiary issue that we just sort of came out of, which is like, oh my gosh, and if everybody's sharing it out, how do you make that a productive space? But how do you even convince people to share what they're finding?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on this question, and my beliefs on this have evolved. So I mentioned that I have this Airtable database, and when this was just a side project, my first question was, how do we incentivize people to contribute? And so I went very deep down the crypto rabbit hole thinking, what if you have a token around aligning incentives? In fact, I, launched a podcast called Tokens, But How? And I talked to all sorts of people. And I think, first of all, a token is not a substitute for building a great product. My sense is that to get people, there's two things that I've learned. One is most people have no qualms about making their knowledge and discoveries public. It's not a question of, I have no problem making my Airtable public, connecting it to other things. What people don't want to lose is the single player utility, right? So if they have a Notion and it has, a very sort of unique way of mapping connections, of being searchable, of being sortable, as long as they can be a node within a larger collective intelligence engine, without compromising the single player utility, I think that people are very willing to do that. I just think that our tools are inadequate. In fact, like Startupy today, which is just an idea baby, our most active users are reading on tools like Matter or Pocket. They're highlighting those tools, they sync to Notion, and then they copy paste from Notion to Startupy. It's insane that they're going through the trouble of doing this. And so I just think that as more and more tools exist, you can't replace those tools. You have to be interoperable with them. And that begs just this question of, there's no data standards and all sorts of like complexities around how these things talk to each other. But I guess my short answer is, you encourage people to contribute by not compromising on single player utility for the particular problem that we are trying to solve.
Thank you. And I'll add just real quick that when I consider a multi-party brain, because I use the brain software and it's the version I use is single user, there is a team brain, but it doesn't work the way I think team stuff should work. Whenever I consider sort of a multi-party thing, starting from where I am with the tool I've used, I always say, and I want there to be a big red button I can hit to take me back to only what I put in. Because my comfort zone is the space that I know that I curated and added. And I'm perfectly happy then to do mind melds with everybody else and become part of the Borg, but I've got to be able to retreat to the stuff I'm familiar with. That's hugely important as a feature request from me.
The appetite that I have personally would be for a kind of multiplayer collective writing, thinking application that I would probably start with extending to a group of friends. I mean, I'd love to have a dozen friends sharing and building together. And then I think this being thoughtful about extending sort of permissions and exposing sections of it, I think would probably need to be part of the process, because I think, this gets a little bit back to the cultural question, right? Because I think that we like to, there's a reason that we like to, we enjoy dinner parties with, a half dozen to a dozen people who we find very interesting, or maybe even people that we love. And there's a safety there and a willingness to have conversations that, were that being broadcast live with, with nasty comments, and that, it would not be the same experience, right? And so I think, I think this kind of, that more transparency and more sharing of a collective brain becomes more attractive, as they're sort of, as one has positive experiences that indicate that that you're not at risk of, of having negative impacts. But oddly, like, we've had, simple tools like, for instance, even just Google Docs, right? And the ability to, we work collectively when we're writing the introductions to our podcast, that all with sometimes one of us, two of us, or three of us will basically write together. So, this has been around for a while. It's not terribly wildly innovative, but just the fact that I can be writing on the fly and I can have a team of sometimes as many as 10 people, all in shared documents in different locations, thousands of miles away. That not long ago would have been quite extraordinary. And so I think that, that with some sort of opportunities to be incremental with the opening of the kimono of one's brain, right, to the world, that we might get there. And I have to think that what will happen is that the benefits of opening up more broadly, right, to greater input from others, will, and I think there are bloggers who enjoy this today, right? Who basically, I mean, there's certainly people today who just put are constantly spilling their ideas out on a daily basis, and they benefit enormously from the collective thinking as a result.
I remember a really long time ago, I was leaving a meeting about the cash healthcare economy, where I'd learned that, I'd never heard about the cash healthcare economy. It was always like, you get health insurance and that's how you pay for healthcare, right? And so I tweeted something, just left an interesting meeting. And then 2 days later on Facebook, because at that time, all my tweets were being posted automatically to Facebook. On Facebook, I get a 8-paragraph message from somebody I don't really know, like a second degree out, who says, "Hey, loved your post. Took my family off of insurance years ago. Here's our experience. It's been actually really good. This is what happened. And I was like, I did not know that in my ripples, there was somebody with a lot of deep experience on this topic, and it was invaluable hearing back. And I wasn't even on a quest to search for input when I did that little random tweet. So I think that safety matters. Safety is a really important design issue here, but there's something going on that's like hive mind or whatever. And I kind of wanted to head a little bit toward this extended mind thesis. Rufus, you've spent a bunch of time recently. You got to interview a couple of people who are key in that sphere, and I'm wondering how what you learned there folds itself into the conversation we're having here.
Well, I think it was so in 1998, Andy Clark and David Chalmers wrote a paper called The Extended Mind Thesis, I believe, right? And it was a very kind of simple but novel idea at the time, which was that, well, what if this is pre-iPhone and pre many things. That when people write things down on a laptop, and at the time it was like the use of laptop computers that inspired this thought, that really if the laptop becomes a partner in thinking, and you start exporting your brain onto this other device, really your brain is extended onto this laptop device. And what I'm trying to remember who said since then that the extended mind thesis was incorrect in 1998 when they came up with it, but it has since become correct, because we now know that if we're separated from our iPhones or smartphones, that we feel debilitated. Right. Because of the persistent proximity of these devices, we have basically all of Google, Wikipedia, everything else is right here all the time. And that's become, part of, it's changed the way I have conversations with my children at dinner.
I was going to say, dinner with kids is not the same as it was 20 years ago.
Right. I mean, why is the sky blue? Boom. I mean, and it's, and though we have a no phones at dinner policy, we do have well, if you're looking up something to add information to the conversation, you're allowed to do that, right? Because it is, so, but they had the additional insight that, well, when people lose a spouse with whom they've cohabitated for decades, it can feel like you've lost a portion of yourself. And that's actually not an illusory sense, because very often people outsource parts of their brains. You literally have your wife or your husband remembers for you a certain range of experiences that you've had, lives that you've lived, people and when you lose that person, you've literally lost part of your brain. And so this becomes more compelling when we think about sort of the power of the extended mind in communities of friends, colleagues, and all the people we potentially connect with through tools like the one that Sari is building.
Yeah, so much of the way that I think that we've structured our information environments is we have so much information, but we don't live in healthy ways with this freedom. And so if we build interfaces that are associative, that if I, on Twitter, if I leave for 5 days, I'm wondering what I missed. If I don't look at Jerry's brain for months and I come back, I'm seeing more and more value, more connections. And so I don't know, I'm obsessed with this idea of how do we learn to live in healthy ways with the freedom afforded to us, which I think goes back to the question of tools. And it's largely a design challenge. I think that we've been sort of like accustomed to the stream, but that is not the only way that we can navigate the internet.
It's also kind of, we've got problems with addiction, problems with the business model, frankly. And so a lot of what you described is our reality presently, because these companies are trying to sell minutes of our engagement on these platforms to advertisers, and they'll do anything in order to get more of that. So we have people trying to wean us off the devices, because on the other hand, people are trying to addict us to the devices, and they're doing a really, really phenomenal job of it. I would say an excellent job of it. So getting to a healthy relationship with information and with one another is going to take, I think, not just acts of will and maybe different or better software, but probably some evolutions in what the models are that are underneath everything. And I'm not entirely clear how that happens. Wikipedia is consistently one of the top 10 visited websites in the world, and it's the only one that leaves no cookies on your device and doesn't have a business model. It has a structure. They receive money for doing what they do. So I think these things are just really there's a challenge here in terms of the fundamental space within which we're trying to do these things that I think are noble and interesting, and trying to get there.
Something else I find interesting is this question of because I have a mediocre memory, I'm really looking forward to, and also I'm just sort of fascinated by technology. I'm really looking forward to augmented reality glasses that will tell me what the name is of the parent whose name I've forgotten, whose children played with my children, and so on. And so but I'm also looking forward to the likelihood that we will have our entire lives recorded in audio. I think audio as an interface is really wonderful, and probably will be, dominant for our interactions with AI assistants.
Mhm.
And just this notion that if I had all of my life heretofore recorded in audio, and potentially video also, but in audio, it would be relatively easy to search for laughter, search for emotion, search for tears, for different types of emotion, search for, and over time, it'll become easier and easier to search for sort of revelation and awe, and and I wonder to what extent in the future some of these tools for organizing our previous ideas and thoughts and conversations will be semi-automated, or that we could sort of teach and nourish, but we'd be able to have these conversations and ideas self-organized to some degree.
It seems like,
Space.
given today's technology, it's not that much of a challenge to detect emotional valence in a conversation. And so you could
Sure.
search back and say, tell me the high points of my week, and play back the 5-minute snippets of what those were, and then go deeper and do that. That doesn't seem like a technological challenge at this point. So it's an interesting world. Sari, do you see audio the same way?
Yeah, I haven't thought too deeply about audio, but I do think a lot about, what are humans best equipped to do, and where can AI and advances in NLP come in. And so we're thinking a lot about sort of like automating connections and suggesting connections. I do think it's very hard for that to replace the ability for humans to associate different conceptual meanings. But we're thinking really deeply about, what is it? Because tagging systems can become extremely complex and messy. So if you think about, maybe there's a tag for knowledge management and one for tools for thought, and there's all of this, like, especially in multiplayer mode, it just becomes a lot more complex, and the duplicate issue and the intent is the same. And so I think technology can really help us with those kinds of things. I think your business model point, Jerry, is really interesting, because I do think that the ad-based business models did create this like massive race for attention that resulted in lack of depth and anxiety and all sorts of things. But I'm not sure that we want to live in a world where the truth is paywalled, but the lies are free, right? So
And
what
that's
is
where we
like
are.
the alternative, right? Like you have this like subscription fatigue, and so
Yep.
you either are the product or you're paying for the product, but what does it mean? And so I think we're like in this in between, and Wikipedia is obviously an example, but it's not for profit. So I'm thinking very deeply about the business model question, because I think that information has zero marginal cost. And so to put a subscription on information seems wrong, because of this zero marginal cost structure of information. But ads has also played out in a way that's not conducive to the kind of sense making that we want. So yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but I'm thinking deeply.
No, thank you. I love those ruminations. There's an old story that may be apocryphal, but back in the days of like audio research and all the geeks at this, that there's a market researcher who asked a little girl, what do you like better, radio or television? And her answer allegedly is radio, because the pictures are better.
Right. Wonderful.
Because our imaginations will like fill in and will do a lot of things. And once you've instantiated something as a visual, your imagination on that visual is narrowed to whatever it is you're watching. So playing with the variables of the medium in different ways, I think, is really interesting and clever. A long time ago, I was doing a panel session at PC Forum about MUDs, moos, and all that kind of stuff. And Amy Bruckman from the MIT Media Lab was on the panel, and she related how one day she's in a moo and she just types in, moos are text-only online environments, and she types in, Amy looks at her shoes and bites her lip as her response to something. And that was just beautiful. And it just communicates so many sorts of things. Right now, all of us maybe aren't that literary, and I'm not sure where that goes, but I think we're at this very interesting cusp where there's so much possibility, and yet we've seen so much messiness and trauma even just the last decade. And I come from the innocent, Silicon Alley web days when it was like, this is awesome, things are going to be good, democracy and so forth. And hey, guess what? Right? The medium has not been conducive to those things. If anything, we've been living through an era of misinformation and bile, much of which was intentionally sort of set upon. I just want to wrap with maybe an optimistic question, which is like, what is your wish or hope for this space? What do you wish we could pull off in 10, 20 years if we sort of keep moving on this?
Yeah, I guess the way I would answer that, I always think of like our job in this world is to acquire knowledge and then share it. And so much of my own sort of personal mission for Startupy is about accelerating the reach of interesting ideas. I think that I've sort of had a career where my job has been to get paid to learn and hang out at the edges of the internet and, spend a lot of time on the internet so more people don't have to. And I really do believe that, the information is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And what does it mean for humans to take back that power? If Google is like organizing the world's information, I think we now need to reorganize the world's information by putting the power back, giving the power back to people. So that's my wish.
Thank you.
I'd love to see it, the process of discovering, ideas and people who can change our minds and empower us to live better lives, to make that far more fluid, and also to make it easier for people to contribute to that flow of ideas, to not have a sort of one-way street of I think of it as sort of like that we currently live in an idea culture that looks in which there's a lot of junk food. And we're trying to build like a Whole Foods, or maybe something better than Whole Foods or whatever. But the
metaphor was going great until the Whole Foods started.
Until Jeff Bezos owned the
yeah, exactly.
But basically to have to make it easier to have some kind of organic, high quality, nutritious sources of ideas that go in both directions. And in a funny way, when we think about this question of the polarization of ideas in recent days, I've been thinking as we've been talking that I do come back to, Socrates refused to write down any of his ideas because he thought that writing was not a good way to communicate ideas. And we only know about Socrates' ideas because Plato, his student, wrote them down. And he might not have entirely been, that sort of sounds outlandish today, but this notion that, as we were talking earlier about how I just think it's so much easier to for us to to have this cacophonous, polarized environment with text than it is with voice. And I could see here's one crazy possible idea. Sorry, like some kind of like I'd love to have when voice is transcribed into text, have some kind of color association with emotion and tone, right? So we can so we can understand that context better. But I think there are going to be a lot of ways where we can have the kind of generosity of conversation more fluidly present in the way that we think together and communicate.
I want to sort of go back to almost the first thing you said, Rufus, which was that books are where ideas go to die, and sort of add a little CPR to that, in the sense of, for me, this isn't just about our media diets and whether we get addicted or we're unhealthy. To me, this is the stakes of civilization. Like our ability to puzzle our way out from all the crises that we're surrounded by depends on our ability to sort this out, the thing we're just talking about. I don't think this is just a lighthearted, gosh, we would have better ideas. I actually think that we're a stupider civilization because we're drowning in the info torrent and being buried by spin, when we will need to make some active measures in order to sort our way through this. And one of the things that pops up for me now and then, which I want to throw in, there's a pattern language called liberating structures, and pattern languages are community-built wisdom, deglazing or synthesizing some hard-won wisdom from practitioners in the field. And liberating structures was created by a bunch of facilitators, and one of the patterns in there is called 1, 2, 4, all. And it says, if you have a big group and a complicated topic, a nice pattern to follow is give them time by themselves, put them in pairs, put them in fours, and come back to plenary. Now, I want to instrument that pattern and any other patterns that are like that. And instrument is the wrong word here, but what I mean is, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there was a chatbot sitting here with us on Zoom that said, oh, Jerry, you might be able to use 1, 2, 4 all right now because it's detected what we're doing in the context we have. Would you like me to run it for you? And if I said yes, it would set up breakout rooms, name them properly, assign people to breakout rooms, put up a timer, put up prompts in the chat, basically run the choreography for me, which is not rocket science. It's all really, really simple stuff to do. You can imagine the code as I'm saying it. You're like, oh yeah, that's doable. And then many more people who are just junior facilitators or complete newbies would suddenly level up and be able to do more powerful, more sophisticated things. So for me, there's a lot of information like that trapped in pattern languages and books and websites and PDFs. I say information goes to die in PDFs as well. How do we bring it into the commons and then make it alive and useful in these different kinds of ways so that we can apply it to our lives and make better lives for everybody? That's one of my goals for this space. Anything either of you would like to say as a wrap up to the conversation?
This has been just a very energizing conversation. I think that I'm very excited about the evolution of how we use communal spaces today, from sharing pictures of what we're doing or what we're eating or how we look, and towards like just building intellectual resonance trails and applying these things to our lives. Because I think one thing that I've learned is that to know something doesn't give you the capacity to apply it. And as somebody that has spent so much time reading, you still need surface areas for practice. And what you were just describing just now is this like just in time applying of these ideas and principles, which sounds just wonderful.
Love that. Love that. Rufus, any thoughts?
Just tremendously exciting. I'm so thrilled that you're doing this, Jerry, and I'm going to be a listener. And it's such an exciting space, and just delighted to be a part of it.
Thank you. I will release you back to your families in a moment. But in the meantime, thank you all for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that might just help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in this sector, please knock on our door at betaworks.com/camp. And thank you so much for being a part of this. We really appreciate it.